All right. Here we are, 5 ways to kickstart 2026. First of all, can you believe it is 2026 already? Gosh, it feels like last year flew by, but was also like 50 years all at once. Most of you who are here live at least have been around me for quite some time. So I like to do this type of thing in the new year. I've organized it, though, down into five, I think, pretty fundamental things, but I'll also give you kind of my own little riff on them as well. Along the way, as I mentioned, you could put some stuff in the chat box. I'll check in from time to time on those, and we could do a little bit of live Q&A if we'd like to. Let's get started, though. I've got 5 things in today's agenda, as you might imagine. Number one is refining your 2026 plan based on the 7 areas of the fulfilled entrepreneur. We're going to talk on that here in just a second. The second, I'm going to give you an update on market conditions and sort of where I see them going. This will be a bit of an add-on from what we covered in our virtual business planning session. If you were with me in Q4 of last year, or if you happen to be in one of the live sessions that I did out on the road, I'll give you an update on sort of what I see coming, and also give you some intel from a number of other, perhaps even smarter people than me, and what they think is coming. The third, we'll discuss seller pricing and positioning, specifically how that's lining up in the new year as we're getting into like listing inventory that's in your pipelines for late January into early February, as we would expect. And then also as we head into an earlier spring market. And then creating buyer urgency, a little bit of refresher there, and also some new updates there. My intent in sections 3 and 4, seller pricing and then buyer urgency, is to give you some things that are very specifically actionable. And then number 5, focusing on what we can control and utilizing our win the week model to be able to do that. So overall, for those of you who have been in our orbit for quite some time, or those of you who are clients of ours, there's going to be some refresher and some new in here. All of it timed for what we're seeing here in the middle of January. Into what's certainly going to be an interesting year for sure. But more on that in just a second. Let's get started with number 1, though, and this is the refinement of your plan based on what I call the 7 areas of the fulfilled entrepreneur. Most of you know I've been working on this project in the background for quite some time. We'll probably roll something more definitive out about this later this year. But this is sort of an upstream to downstream approach of the way we would coach you to look at life and business. It's what we strive to model as well. You'll notice that these first 5 areas have nothing to do with business, and that's quite intentional. Let me give you my brief definition of each of these, and then I'll pose a question or two for you to play around with in your notes here during the live session. Number 1, spirituality, I define as anything that feeds your soul. It could be religious, although it doesn't have to be. It could be philanthropic. It could be meditation or quiet time. There's a zillion different things that could potentially fall in the zone of spirituality for you. Number 2, mindset / mental fitness. Pretty self-explanatory, but this ties pretty closely in line with what we talk about as the 3 things that you can control, which we'll also touch on later today. But the number 1 part that we can control always is our mindset / mental fitness. Number 3, your body / physical fitness. That's everything from exercise to nutrition to hydration and sleep quality. This is a time of year where very often, myself included, we all have goals that we've set for the year in this particular area. And this can also be the time of year, if we're not careful, that we begin slipping on those, quote, New Year's resolutions. So perhaps there's some physical fitness related things worth revisiting. Number 4, the you for you element is the healthy selfishness. That is you recharging your own personal battery. That is you making sure you've got enough energy to give to others within the key relationships, or to your clients, or to your team members. And number 5, you for or with others, the key relationships that are within your life. We won't spend a ton of time on this today because many of you have heard me talk about this topic before. However, the way I do want to pose this as a question for you in your notes is I'd like for you to think of a time, could be currently, could be in the past. I'd like for you to think of a time when your business or your businesses were going really well. And I'd like for you to think of the things that lived upstream of that. Said a slightly different way, what were the things going on in categories 1 through 5 in your life that made the business or businesses and then the financial aspect of those things made it infinitely easier. Now, this might be more of a homework assignment where you reflect back and analyze each of these 5 categories. But the question I'd pose to you today, as one of the things that you could do to kickstart 2026, excuse me, is you'd say, if I were to focus on one of these 5 areas, and I were to pick something to either start doing, or perhaps you already began doing it to start this calendar year, and really lean in on that thing. I'll give you an example. For me, what I know about myself, and I have also been told about those people who are in my key relationships, is that if I don't exercise, I get really crabby and sometimes difficult to be around. So for me, the thing that probably lives most upstream of all other positive outcomes would be staying really committed to my physical fitness and all elements that point to that. So I'm going to give you like maybe 60 to 90 seconds here just to think about a small handful, or maybe even just one thing that lives in one of these first 5 categories that you would say, I want to stay really committed to this thing for January, for the first couple of months of the year, to give me a really solid kickstart. Be 60 to 90 seconds and we'll get back together. As you've worked through this, and hopefully by now you've come up with your answers, I'd love to hear from a few of you in the chat box, those of you who are here with us live, and what's something that you came up with, something you're already doing it right now, or you're recommitting to an item that lives upstream of your business activities that you know is going to be a catalyst for better success in 2026. Awesome. Thanks. Brent says working on physical health, multi-level approach to that. Love that. Krista says fitness. Excellent. Anybody else have anything they want to share? Judy focused on health. Excellent. Thanks, Judy. Zach reading each morning for 30 minutes. Love that. Great way to set the intention for the day. Excellent. Okay. So this would be a great thing to come back and revisit. If you haven't already polished each of these 7 sections for your 2026 plan, I'll also, in the follow-up commentary that I send to you guys, I'll link to the virtual business planning session we did a couple of months ago, where I go on kind of a long run on this particular segment and then how it feeds into number 6 and 7. All right. So the first one is focus on one of these 7 areas, preferably something in the first 5. Let's talk about predictions, market direction for just a little brief minute here. These were my predictions when we were in Q4 doing business planning season. Refresher for those of you who were at some of those. I felt like, and I still feel like, more on this in a second, that interest rates have likely bottomed, that the end of year rate cuts were already priced in. We saw that. Lack of clarity on 2026 rate policy, tariff overhangs, domestic and geopolitical uncertainties. The analogy I've often used, and will probably continue to use for quite some time, is that you're driving on the winding roads in the mountains, and it's foggy and maybe misty, and you can sort of see the road in front of you, but you can't see very far. You can't really even see to the edge of your headlights. But there's enough road that you can sort of keep going and keep meandering through the curves. My personal opinion is that we're still in a market very similar to that, and I don't know that we're going to have any significant lifting of the fog, so to speak, that will allow us to aggressively move faster. So there is a lot of like How do we take all the stuff that's going on, make sense of it, and stay focused on the things that we can control, which is why you're all here today. The second, this has continued to prove out, much like the first one has. Job market likely continue to weaken. We saw that in last week's jobs report. We're really the only sector where you're seeing any meaningful job growth is healthcare, and that's mostly tied to the aging boomer population, which we've talked a lot about, and their impact on real estate. Additionally, what you're seeing is corporate leaders questioning how much staff they actually need. Could they replace them with AI? Could they enable people with AI and just decide not to hire any additional folks? So the headline here is that you're not really seeing mass layoffs per se, but you're also not seeing a lot of new hiring either. You could potentially see if rates push lower if we got major weakness in jobs. But since all of us are in real estate, we really wouldn't want major weakness in jobs because people who don't have jobs don't buy houses. So there's sort of this like, be careful what you wish for on rates. I'd encouraged you at the end of last year, so this is picking up where we left off and further how we're planning into Q1 of this year, really to build your business on two scenarios. One is if the market stays stalled, which minus some seasonality, which I'll talk about, I think is still my base case, and or rates move back above 6.5, which very few people are talking about, but I think is more likely than most are predicting. More on that too. I think you'll see in 2026, the market will largely continue to bounce along sideways, most of like it did in 2025. That's still my working theory at the moment, is that 26 looks a lot like 25, fits and starts, bright spots and dark spots. But overall, you largely see nationwide, at least. Of course, every market's different, but we're talking nationally right now since we represent people all over the country. My thought on this is that you're likely to see prices basically flat or maybe a smidge up nationally, and that you'll see units basically flat, maybe a smidge up nationally. Not a popular opinion, as you'll see in a second, but to each their own. If, and this is a big if rates go below 6, probably significantly under 6, and this is not an or, this is and broader market uncertainties resolve, seems unlikely to me, you'll see something more in line with NAR's predictions, which I have a slide for you. But I'd like for you to really still think about your 2026 plan in both of these scenarios. So scenario one is flat in all things. How will you and or your team members go pursue growth? How will you make sure you get the type of market share that you want to achieve your 2026 goals? Then also if, and this would be the more optimistic version, if we see rates continue to go down, that pushes up buyer demand. We see 10% plus growth in unit count, 3 to 4% growth in prices. How would you take advantage of that? How would you make sure that you have the bandwidth within your organization? Maybe you need some more admin help. Maybe you need a buyer's agent or showing assistant. So you kind of have to strategically think about both of those. If you asked me here on January 13th to make a bet as to which one of these two scenarios play out, knowing a lot of things could change, I'm betting on scenario one, but also being prepared for scenario two. Our friends at NAR, all respect to them, but they have scenario two as their case. In December, they did a forecast for 2026. They revised their 2025 forecast. December is an interesting time to do that, but that's a different story altogether. Their 2026 forecast, they see plus 14% in existing home sales, plus 5%. This is unit count in new home sales, up 4% in median home sale price. So this is like scenario two math. Again, my personal opinion is that's aggressive, but if we get it, we'll take it. They see mortgage interest rates finishing the year at 6.0, which is pretty much where we are right now. More on that later. They see 1.3 million job gains. Of note, the recent print on that was 50,000 in a month. So 12 50,000s don't get us to 1.3 million. But we'll see how that plays out. And then unemployment at 4.5, which is a downward revision. They had previously projected 5.5. And somewhere in that band is probably accurate, and the market could certainly sustain that. You're like, all right, cool, Middleton. What do we do about all that information? I think you just know what's out there and then adjust accordingly. And then let's talk about what to do about all of these things and what to do specifically about it right now. So point 2 was to kickstart the year is understanding current market conditions, where they are headed. And I'm going to weave some of that commentary in through the rest of our time together today. Third point, seller pricing and positioning. You're looking to kickstart the year. This is probably the biggest one we've been talking about on coaching calls with clients in the first couple of weeks of this year. So I'll give you my take on all of it. Most of this is kind of anecdotal at the moment because we don't have a ton of data on it yet. But let's start with listing inventory. You know, because all of you who are on this live are pros in this business, you know that typically we see an increase in inventory in late January and into early February. And there's really 2 factors for that. It was the people who were thinking seriously about listing their homes the end of last year, but didn't want to do it over the holidays. And then you have the people who maybe weren't talking to you about listing, but they internally were talking or thinking about it in their family at the end of last year. They woke up on January 2nd and called you and said, come list me. And now as you're working through your pipelines, what we've seen across all of our clients and our coaches and I were talking about this yesterday in our monthly mastermind session of coaches, we see a lot of your pipelines building up with coming soon listings, which is great. Most of those coming soon listings kind of start to hit mid-January into early February, which is also great if you're a listing agent. By and large, we're seeing listing pipelines build out faster and more robustly than we are buyer pipelines, which we'll touch on in a second. So you could anticipate, and I think this will come through in the print, but you can anticipate in most markets we're going to see a spike in listing inventory headed into like late January and into early February. All right. Okay, cool. Well, maybe as a listing agent, I like that. What we're also seeing more of, and hopefully you're experiencing the same, is that the new sellers, this coming soon inventory, seem to be much more realistic about pricing, seem to be much more realistic about market conditions. Someone described it to me the other day by saying it's probably just because like 2021 and early 2022 is just farther in the rearview mirror now, which I would agree with. You're like, all right, great. So if more listing inventory is coming and those are generally priced properly, which hopefully they are, what does that mean for our existing inventory? And I'm sure you're already working on this, but if you're not, this would be another way to kickstart the year, is every one of those active listings that you have that have been sitting with you for a while, now is the time, like all caps, full stop. Now is the time that those people must get serious about pricing, because there's 2 things that are happening that point to this. And you're seeing this, I'm sure, is there are buyers out there right now who are taking advantage of lower rates, taking advantage of psychological decision-making that happens this time of the year. And those buyers are buying the houses that are priced properly and in great condition. So there's a existing seller play where it's like, I really don't want to wait until we get into the early spring. I don't want to wait until warmer weather shows up. I don't want to wait until whatever event they're waiting on that suddenly is going to cause them to get serious about pricing. Because if all the things that we're seeing right now in your pipelines pull through and hit the market, your active listings are going to get undercut by the pricing and the strategy of your new listings. Or more broadly applicable to the market, the new stuff is going to shine a lot prettier than the old stuff. So it's in this window that's maybe, I don't know, another week or 2 at most, that I think you can really, really push your sellers, excuse me, really push your sellers to get aggressive about pricing. In the event that your new listings are not super serious about pricing, or they're still in that like, let's test it and see mode, I want to remind you about something that we've been talking about for as long as I can remember. And that is that every house has 2 prices. And if you're not already talking about this in your listing consultations, or maybe even in some of your marketing material or in your pre-listing conversations, please add this. So every house has 2 prices. The first is the appraisal approach. As you know, that's the one you're going to arrive at by looking at sold comps, and you're going to apply some spreadsheet math to it and some price per square foot and some adjustments. And you can lick your finger and hold it up in the wind and see which direction all of that's blowing. A lot of science, a little bit of art, a little bit of experience, and then you're going to come up with a number. However, what you also know is that in the market that we're in right now, for the most part, that number is higher than the buyers are willing to pay for it. But let's rewind the tape for just a second. And you go back to like the middle of 2020, immediate post-COVID era, summer of 2020, basically all the way through like January or February of 2022. That like 18 to 20 month run that the market went on, that we would all agree was fun while it lasted, but we'll probably never see again. The appraisal approach said the house is worth this, and the buyer was willing to pay some number significantly higher than that. And what you also know is over the past 3.5, pushing 4 years now, that has flipped, where the house has incrementally grown in value over that 4-year period, but what the buyer is willing to pay is much lower than that. So the distinction there, I think, is really important for the sellers, where you could arrive at a good spreadsheet number, you could arrive at a good, mathematically sound appraisal approach value of a house. But at the end of the day, as you see continued growth in inventory, and you see continued price adjustments, and you see continued withdrawals, and you see some of the highest fallout rate on contracts we've seen in recorded market history, all of that, at least in the short run, points to advantage buyer. And to the extent that your sellers understand that before you go to the market, you're much more likely to get your pricing correct right out of the chute. So here's the full thing on a bumper sticker related to sellers. This is a duh statement, but hopefully I armed you with enough information to see it, is that pricing right now is the single most important thing you can do for your listings. I do not believe that this is the time to wait and see. I do not believe that this is the time to wait on the spring or St. Patrick's Day or the lotto ticket or the whatever it is that people are talking about they want to wait and see on. Let's get them adjusted and get them sold now, particularly before this new stuff comes and undercuts your existing listings. All right, so there's number 3. Let's go over to number 4, creating buyer urgency. And there's a broader question here about how do you create urgency where there isn't any. So let me tackle that topic first, because while rates are important and where they're headed are important, those are largely beyond our control. We've got to be, I've used the phrase a lot, proactively reactive. And what does that mean? So proactively reactive just says, as rates are coming down, I got to be ready to jump on that because it's going to create some buyer urgency. But in the absence of broader market buyer urgency, and this is maybe not in the notes here, this is just me rambling for a second, I'd like for you to think about more ways to put lightning in a bottle to create the illusion of demand. I'll give you a real specific example. Last week, and with permission to share, last week I was talking with a client, a coaching client of mine, about a listing and that she has. It's been sitting for a little bit. And we had this discussion about pricing and positioning and timing that you and I just went through. And this was, say, like, I don't know, Wednesday or Thursday of last week. And the seller is really pushing the listing agent to do another open house and then get the feedback on that open house. And then maybe the seller would be open to a price adjustment after that open house. And if the feedback was like, yeah, you probably need to reduce the price, then they were going to reduce the price and then do another open house. Now, keep in mind, this was not the listing agent's idea. There's a collective eye roll of all of us as listing agents in this. And of course, the answer is, let's get the price adjustment first. Let's properly position for all reasons previously discussed. And then let's do the open house and see if we can drive a lot of the illusion of demand in that one spot. Not to over-explain something you know well, but I really want you to be thinking about this from a marketing standpoint. Is think of it this way. If for your listing that you've properly priced, you're getting showings just kind of trickling in from time to time. Maybe you're getting, 3 to 5 a week. I think we would all agree that there's a big difference in 3 to 5 showings trickling in over the course of a week, or 3 to 5 showings all happening in a 2-hour window, and those people were bumping in and going. Think about what it was like from like mid 2020 all the way into early 2022. And there were cars lined up down the street, and agents were like passing keys to one another, even though that was a no-no. And what buyers felt was this fear of missing out. And it was mathematically true then, where in most markets, it is not mathematically true right now. So as a marketer, you'd be thinking about, how do I create this illusion of demand? One of them would be timing your price adjustments in such a way that you price adjust, and then the next day is an open house, but perhaps your open house is constrained to a 1-hour window. Or perhaps your open house is constrained to a 90-minute window, and you've invited all of the neighbors. And are all of those people going to be buyers or sellers? No, but if you can get the 2 or 3 buyers who are the serious buyers for that property in at approximately the same time, and you have all this other traffic coming and going, you may, emphasis on may, be able to create a little bit more buyer demand. Outside of pricing properly and being in really good condition, which classically you're always going to be focused on, outside of marketing to create the illusion of demand, we're largely still stuck in this thing where rates provide the additional catalyst that we're looking for. So let's talk about current rates. Let's talk about where they're headed. I'm going to give you some probably unpopular but economically accurate information about the role that uncertainty and Fed meddling and all the other noise that's happening politically is weighing on the market. But hold your breath, grab your popcorn. We'll talk about that in a minute. For now, let's talk about the boring but important stuff. Here's a mortgage rate graph, courtesy of Housing Wire, mortgage rate graph from early 2022 when rates started to go up, all the way to, I pulled this morning, so this is technically yesterday's data. Most of you have seen this because I reference this pretty regularly as I'm updating. But here's the highlight reel of this. Rates started going up. That had pushed downward pressure on unit count. And then early 23, and then like summer of 24, you have 2 spots where we hit 6, actually dipped a little below 6 on FHA. And now here we are in this little window where we're bouncing along sideways. Let me give you a zoomed in view of that. Here's a 1-year view of what's happened with mortgage interest rates. But what's interesting, and you've seen this in most of your markets as well, you would think if we were sitting around roughly this time last year, which we were, talking about where rates were and where they needed to go, what most of us were saying at that point in time is that if we saw something 6 or below, or something with a 5 handle in front of it, that should be more stimulative to buyer demand, but it's only been incrementally stimulative. All right. So, what does all of this mean? For the past roughly 60 days, we've seen rates bouncing along near a 3-year low. There's been a little uptick, but in the early part of this year, I would attribute that largely to seasonality. But you're like, okay, if the buyer's sitting around waiting on rates, we've talked before, and I'm not gonna rehash it here about the hidden cost of waiting. I'll link to that in the thing that I send you afterward if you haven't seen my riff on that lately. But they're sitting around like, okay, well, we're at 6. Maybe they're going to go lower. Maybe I'll just wait because affordability continues to be a challenge, which is mathematically true. But then it's like, all right, so what are you waiting for? I referenced this in the business planning session, but here's the refresher on it. These are year-end targets for the 30-year fixed. For these 4 large organizations with full research departments, not just like some dude sitting in his home office drinking coffee, which is me. So Fannie has it at 5.9. NAR, you saw this earlier, 6.0. The home builders have it at 6.25. The Bankers Association has it at 6.4. They've actually been the ones kind of warning a little bit on rates moving higher rather than lower. I happen to be in that camp as well. So if your buyer's sitting around and saying, I've been waiting on rates to come down, you're not hearing this as much right now. I'm aware of that, but it's still out there, the affordability issue and how rates impact that. 3-year low, 3-year low extended over a 60-day period. You have plenty of people. This is the average rate lock from yesterday. So this is across all credit score profiles. You have really credit-worthy buyers who are getting high fives right now. I'm aware of that. But then you're like, all right, well, how much lower can they go? Basically, no one has a number lower than like 575 on the 30-year fixed by the end of the year. A couple other things that you'll want to recall. 85% of fixed rate mortgages are locked below the current rate. This is from a Goldman Sachs report. 70% of mortgages are locked sub 5%. 2-3 years ago, we were talking about the happily stuck people, those folks with that locked below 5%. That's still there. But as time goes on and people are making more peace with the fact that rates are what they are and people are moving on with their lives, then I think this is less of an issue from a demand standpoint than it is mathematically. But full circle here, doesn't appear that rates are going to go meaningfully lower unless we saw some big employment-related crisis. If you're watching this live, you probably saw this morning also that the inflation reading for the month was a 2.7, still a long way off from the target of 2.0, but marginally better than was forecast. And employment is basically flat. So we're kind of in this like sideways band right now where it's a little uncertain as to where rates are going to go. Let me go back to, so that's sort of rate predictions and where they're going. The likely trends in seller supply and buyer demand. I've already talked about that some, but let's extend it out just a little bit further, headed into the spring market. So we already talked about like late February into early January, what we should do about current sellers, what we should do about current buyers. That is, time to act is now. The reason I think it's a good time for buyers to act now is rates likely, I don't want to say likely, it's a possibility, and one that nobody's talking about, that rates would actually move upward from where they are. But hold that thought, and let's look at seller supply and buyer demand as we head into the early spring. What you also know, and we're already hearing from a lot of you as we're looking farther out in your pipelines, is this second wave of listing inventory that tends to come to the market into the early spring. And it's classically the people who want to take advantage of spring seasonality, where normally we would see higher buyer demand. I think if, all caps, if you see rates continue to hang around the high 5s to low 6s and move along sideways, you will see a seasonally based bump in buyer demand. The thing I'm not sure about, and I don't think this is knowable, the thing I'm not sure about is to what extent the seller's supply would continue to outpace the buyer demand. Early indications for the year is that seller supply is outpacing buyer demand. If that trend line continues, I don't think it's out of bounds to say that buyer demand would be marginally up as we head into the spring, but seller supply would continue to grow in most markets. And what you know is that would put downward pressure on pricing. That creates better scenarios for buyers if that happens, but also puts more pressure on sellers. Full circle on that comment, that would just mean that your sellers really need to be more purposeful about pricing right now, because the only scenario in which, maybe not the only, but the most likely scenario in which you would see upward pressure on prices headed into the spring would be if you saw seller supply continues to, marginally go up, but something happens that would cause a big spike in buyer demand. Probably the only thing that could do that would be if you saw rates move below like 5.5, and there's just nobody calling for that right now. And it would take some big employment crisis, or you might think that with some Fed pressure, that might happen, or with some perhaps additional mortgage-backed security bond buying, that might happen. It could, but here's the thing nobody's really talking about. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but it's worth watching. Is and I'd encourage you to do your own research on this as well, because there's a lot of confusing news out there. But with the current state of affairs and the political pressure being placed on the Fed, if, and this is a big if the market perceived that the Fed was being influenced by politics, you might get some short-term relief in rates, but long-term, what would happen is you'd actually see mortgage rates and most other lending rates go up. I started talking about this in like late 2024. Those of you who are out with us, this is almost a year and a half ago, in business planning sessions or in our live event we did in Raleigh back then. I had this slide that we called good ideas and not so good ideas. And my comments at the time, this was November and December of 2024. My comments at that time were that the not so good ideas were political meddling with the Fed, tariffs, and over restrictive immigration policy. And unfortunately, my observation has been that all three of those things have happened, but nobody asked me my opinion. But here's what all that means, not to get too political about it, but this does matter, is in order for investors, particularly bond investors, to be able to trust what's happening with U.S. currency and U.S. financial policy, they also have to be able to trust that that's not being influenced by politics. And if investors believe that rates are being artificially pushed down from politics, what they begin to immediately infer is that inflation will go up, which mathematically is true. And then if inflation is going to go up, those investors demand a higher return on their investment, i.e., they have to charge more interest for the money that they lend to the various parts of, whether it be our government or into mortgage-backed securities. So not to get too far into a soapbox, although I might have already done that, forcing interest rates lower in a time where that's probably not the best idea based on what you're seeing in inflation data and job data, could have a short-term like flash in the pan, almost like putting lighter fluid on a bonfire, and we could see a quick run on that, but ultimately would be bad long-term because long-term rates would have to go up. Like, all right, Bill, thanks for the wet blanket on the second week of January. But the reason I'm mentioning all of this to you, and I don't think you need to get into all of this with your clients, this is just for you to be aware of. The reason I'm mentioning all of this to you is that if you looked at this graph or put this in front of your buyers and you said, really good time mathematically compared to where we were a year ago, you put this now almost 4-year chart in front of your buyers, and you said there have been 1, 2, 3 times since 2023 that mortgage interest rates have gone this low, it seems unlikely to me that they're going to move lower. Could they? Sure. And you could always play the buy the right house, refinance it later, all that stuff. But I think this is a window that a lot of buyers are sleeping on right now. And I think they're additionally thinking that this line is just going to move lower. My opinion, full stop here, would be that we have too many catalysts of uncertainty out there that would cause these rates to move higher. Even if we don't have those catalysts, here are your year-end targets from people who are way smarter than me. Okay, over the river and through the woods we go to part number 5, focus on what we can control. A lot of that other stuff we talked about, while very relevant, is beyond my control and beyond your control. We come back to the things that we've talked about for almost 20 years I've been in this business. The 3 things that we can control. Number 1 is our mindset/attitude. That might go all the way back to point number 1 from today. Number 2 is the effort that we're putting into the things that we're doing. So very fundamentally, this is like the get up, go to work, focus on hitting your appointment numbers. Make sure that the outbound effort is consistent with the expectation that the market moves along sideways and that the market's not going to come rescue you. If we do end up getting some sort of market-based tailwind, awesome, we'll ride that wave, but don't count on it. Number 3 would be the skills with which we do things. So hopefully part of the commentary I've given you today, particularly in like where market conditions are relative to the past and where they might go, specifically what we want to be doing with sellers right now, specifically what we want to be doing with buyers right now. Hopefully that helps even further refine the skill element of this. You would drill that all the way down into a question I still ask myself every week. And that is, what do I need to do to win the week? This becomes your must-do list, your high priority action items. But you'd say, based on my goals for 2026, which hopefully you either have locked in or you're very close to having locked in, here's what I need to accomplish for Q1. If you're looking at like transaction count as an example, roughly 20% of your business, this is adjusted for seasonality, roughly 20% of your business should be closed in Q1. So if your goal this year is to sell 30 houses, then 20% of that would be 6. You need to have 6 contracts on the board for Q1. Now, if you're not at 6 right now, let's say you're at 3 right now. Awesome. Good start to the year. 13 days into the year, you got 3 contracts on the board, but you've got about 4 or 5 more weeks to put that gap of 3 on the board for the quarter. But you could look at that for any goal set that you have. What do I need to do in Q1? That would at least be 20% of my annual goal adjusted for seasonality. Based on that, what do I need to do in January? We blinked and we're almost halfway through the month already. So what do I need to do between now and the end of the month? Based on that, what do I need to do in order to win this week? That list should be no more than 3 to 5 things in your business, no more than 3 to 5 things personally. These are not your to-do lists. These are your must-do lists, and drilling that down to win the week. All right, so here's what we covered, and then I'll open it up for a little Q&A because we finished a few minutes early. The 5 things that are going to kickstart the year for us. Number 1, our mindset/attitude and the areas that we're going to focus on based on that fulfilled entrepreneur framework. Number 2, our better understanding of market conditions and the predictions of where those are going. Number 3, seller pricing and positioning, both how that shapes up for our new listings coming to the market and for our existing listings, getting them adjusted before we get to the end of the month. Number 4, creating buyer urgency by helping them understand now is the time to get off the fence. And then number 5, we're going to focus on the things that we can control. So with that, I'm going to bounce back over to the chat box here for just a second. And if there are things that you'd like to add, either questions that you'd like for me to address, or perhaps key takeaways from today's session, would love to hear those. And then we'll wrap up. What you got for me? Going once. Going twice. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you being here with me this afternoon. And I'll be sure that you get a copy of the recording if you'd like that. And if there are other resources or other things that I could do to help you, can reach me at bill@middletonelitecoaching.com, bill@middletonelitecoaching.com. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your afternoon.